All right, thank you, Sarah. And thanks everyone, as Sarah said, for joining us here. We're going to get into targeting your DevOps bottlenecks and how we can do that with connected lifecycle data. As Sarah said, I'm a pre-sales engineer with TaskTop currently, so I get to work with our prospects and our customers, talk about their challenges and find solutions. But before that, I was involved in a variety of different QA roles, from functional testing on a waterfall team to automated testing with our agile development teams, all the way through to actually having ownership of a lot of the testing tools that we used within the QA organization. So one of the reasons that I love TaskTop and that I really wanted to come work at TaskTop is because TaskTop's solving two of the biggest challenges that I had during that 10-year career in QA. One of them being that when I had my test management tool that I was administering, that all of our testers were using, we also had tools like Blueprint that were being used by the business analysts to define requirements. We had tools like Microsoft TFS and Jira that were being used by the developers to manage those work, and none of that information flowed between those tools. The other piece of that was we didn't have a really good way of getting data out of the tools so that we could produce meaningful reports. And so that's a lot of what I'm going to focus on here today. But to get started, when a lot of companies kick off a DevOps or Lean or Agile journey, you know what's necessary to get started. If you're kicking off your DevOps journey, you're more than likely going to focus on automating the delivery pipeline. With Agile, you're going to focus on getting standing teams or Scrum teams in place, putting daily stand-ups in, sprints that last a couple of weeks, so on and so forth. And then the other piece of any of these transformations is going to be a major focus on culture. But what we're going to look at today is once you're 6 months in or 1 year in, where you're starting to see gains, but you're also kind of stalling out and you're not sure what to do next. That's where we're going to be looking at, helping you identify what's next. Or in some cases, you might be 7 or 8 or 9 years into your transformation. You've become extremely good at it, but you know that there's more you can do to get better. So figuring out where to go from there. So first we're going to take a look at how a lot of companies are approaching reporting or metrics today. And I've broken these kind of into 3 categories. Some of them are still very valuable and meaningful. Others can actually be counterproductive. They can actually hurt you. Starting from the top, we have tactical metrics. And I'm classifying all of these as kind of technical metrics by nature. But the tactical metrics are the ones that are going to help you make go, no-go decisions typically. Are we ready to release is a pretty common one. And so you're looking at things like how many defects do we have open? What's the breakdown by severity? How many tests have been executed? How many of our test cases are being blocked because of some of those open defects? And then you also start to look at how many tests are we executing for this release cycle versus the average number of tests that we've executed over the past couple of years, or open defects in this release cycle compared to open defects that you've had over releases in the last couple of years. And really starting to help you understand, are we ready to put something into production, or do we need to pull back, do some more work before we actually go live and provide this new capabilities to our customers. The second category is going to be a focus on the team. A lot of times I would associate this with the Agile teams and things that you're talking about in your retrospectives or things that you're managing day in and day out in your stand-ups. How many story points are we delivering? If I look at those story points that we delivered this sprint or this iteration, how much of that work is going towards new features? How much of that work is going towards actually fixing defects that we caused in this sprint or in previous sprints? And then how much of that work is going towards paying down technical debt, as well as the standard burn up, burn down type of reports that you have. So the first two are very useful in in specific situations, whether it's making go, no-go decisions, or you're actually working within your team to improve your individual team. But this last one can actually be pretty detrimental. And I unfortunately see this quite a bit when companies will come to us and they'll want to start tracking metrics. They've got an initiative to start tracking and do better with their metrics. But they don't know where to go. And a lot of them start out with, I call these the because I can metrics, where they don't know what to measure, so they're going to go on Google and run a couple of searches and find some metrics that everyone else is tracking, and just start tracking those as your own. Another one is we're going to measure what we know is easy or what we have access to, because we know we can get that. We can get a quick win, if you will, out of that. But a lot of times you're tracking these things and you don't really know why. You don't know what you're trying to get out of it. So generally these are going to be the bad types of metrics that we see. So one of the customers that we were working with actually said this quote on a call when we were talking to the teams about what we want to measure and how we want to measure. He said that we're measuring effort, and that's like measuring a sports team based on the number of hours that we're practicing instead of the number of wins that we're producing. So we need to focus more of our measurement on the outcome that we're getting out of the software delivery teams. So that's where we're going to focus today. We're going to dig in on how we can measure the outcome. We're going to use those measurements to figure out what effort needs to improve so that we can have better outcome in the future. So in order to do that, we're not going to be focusing on those lower level, the technical types of metrics that we just talked about. We're going to be focusing on bigger business value types of metrics. And I provided a couple of different categories of those types of higher level business value metrics here on the screen. Cost, time, quality, productivity are the four big ones that come to mind a lot of the times. And the interesting thing with these that doesn't always apply to some of those other metrics is that now we're starting to have a need to aggregate data from across multiple tools. So if we're looking at a cost per story point, yeah, we can go to our Agile tool, we can figure out how many story points were delivered, we can figure out how much effort the development team put into some of these story points, but we still need to go to the PPM tool to figure out how much those developers actually cost, what's the rate of those developers for the company if we want to track cost. There's another aspect of this in that QA and building the test cases, running these test cases is often kind of built in to the story point, but that's tracked in your test management tool. So you need to have details from that test management tool as well to understand the total cost per story point for your organization. The metric that we're going to focus on today, or I guess the category of metric that we're going to focus on today, is time, and more specifically the lead time to deliver business value. So we're looking at when a request is actually made by the business or to the business for some new high-level capability or new change to the applications, all the way through until the time that that request is actually delivered into production. Now, back in the days of waterfall, this might have been a little bit easier to track because you would have had a project plan. That project plan would have start dates and end dates, and you would be able to look at that Gantt chart and really see all of the details that you need. But the problem is, a lot of times, this is like cost, it's going to span multiple systems. And so not only do we need to be able to get the data out of each one of these systems, but we need to have the appropriate detail in that data to provide traceability across the entire life cycle. And that traceability is really driven by just the fact that software delivery is a relay race. How many handoffs are going to be necessary to get something from an idea into production? each one of those handoffs, whether it's between two individuals or two teams or between two tools, that's going to require us to extract data from multiple tools, and it's going to require us to have traceability between those tools as well. So this is the approach that we're going to take today as we step through this. First of all, to really start to track the lead time from beginning to end, or the end-to-end cycle time, we need to understand the value chain and how value flows through the system. So we're going to start by breaking that down, making sure that we're able to connect that value chain. And then we're going to produce that or talk about that high-level report that's going to show us the dates associated with different milestones throughout the value chain. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to start to identify where the bottlenecks are. Are we running into bottlenecks in code and test? If so, now we can start to get a little more specific with some of these metrics and start looking at what's the defect mean time to resolution, or how many of our builds come out the other end and they're in a deployable state, for example. So rather than focusing on all of these specific technical metrics right out of the gate, we need to figure out where we want to focus our time and energy by starting with that higher level metric. And then down here, we're still going to have routine reporting, but we're not going to be touching on that at all today. That's going to be, that's Scrum team metrics that we talked about earlier. That's going to help the individual teams get better, but it's not really going to change. It's not really going to produce that organizational change that the organization, the company is looking for. All right, so the first step is going to be, how do we understand the value chain? We need to look at the specific value chain for our organization and start to break that down. So I've started here with a pretty basic, pretty common, in my mind, value chain where we've got requests, business requests that are coming into the front of the system. There's going to be effort that takes place to kind of break down that business request, figure out what applications are being impacted, how long is it going to take, what's it going to cost me, and those are going to go into and drive the approvals. Is this something that we want to fund, something we want to move forward with and approve, or are we going to throw this out and move on to the next request? Once that approval happens, now we're starting to break this original request down into more technical requests. It could be features, epics, user stories, all the way down to tasks, or it could be more business requirements and functional requirements, but there's going to be some sort of request or artifact that's going to get broken down further from that original request. Once that's been broken down and defined, we're going to start to write code, validate that code, build it, test it further, and then we're going to deploy it into various environments, whether it's a dev, a test, a stage, and then ultimately into productions and into more of an operations mode. So this is going to be the high-level value chain that we're focusing on today. And what we're going to notice is that as we kind of step through and iterate through this process of identifying the value chain and connecting the value chain and then figuring out how we measure the value chain, we're going to be stepping through this from beginning to end and really taking a lot of different, or looking at this from a lot of different perspectives. So first of all was just to go through, understand the value chain, take all of the tools out of the picture, and just understand that value chain piece. Now that we understand that, we'll start back at the beginning and start to look at the tools and how those play into the value chain at your organization. So in this case, we have ServiceNow, and we're using the demand management capabilities within ServiceNow to create that demand or those demand objects in ServiceNow to be able to start to say, what's this going to cost me? What's the revenue impact that I can expect from this change? Who needs to approve it? How long is it going to take? What's the ROI? All of those different things are going to be managed within ServiceNow and ultimately approved within ServiceNow. The technical components of this are going to happen in Jira. So we've got new features, epics, stories, tasks that are all being managed in Jira, maybe even some of the defects as well. Management of all of those artifacts are taking place on the Jira side. And then ultimately we're using Microsoft TFS and the build, deploy, release management capabilities in TFS to allow us to take that code change that's being developed based on what's defined in Jira, build it, further verify it, deploy it to different environments, and then ultimately into production. So now that we understand how the tools fit in here, we can start to see that we're getting pockets of traceability that are showing up. On the left-hand side, we've got everything related to the request exists within ServiceNow. When it was created, when it was, who it went to for approval, when it was approved, and so forth. In the middle, we've got technical requests that are actually being tied to code changes that are being made, and all of that's being handled with Jira and with the Atlassian stack. And then on the Microsoft release and deploy components, we can very easily see how a build is related to a deployment, which is related to a release. So we've got these pockets of traceability, but the problem is there are still very manual, very painful steps within the process that disconnects this value chain when you look at it end to end. And some of those manual steps are going to be, say for example, once that demand is approved within ServiceNow, somebody has to take that approved demand and create a new feature in Jira so that it can be tracked, so that it can be broken down further on the Jira side. But what happens when that demand changes in ServiceNow after the fact? Is somebody going to take that change and make sure that it also gets into Jira, or are we going to have the business expecting one thing based on what's being defined in ServiceNow, and the developers are creating something that could be very different based on the old information that they have in Jira? On the other side, there could be emails going back and forth that maybe a deployment failed and we need a developer to look at that. Instead of that being kind of an automated process, there's emails flowing back and forth, and there's just a lot of breakdowns within the value chain here. And those breakdowns are going to cause people to be upset. It's going to cause a lot of challenges, and really for different people across the entire organization, from the individuals who are having to do the manual processes all the way up through to management, who are the ones that are actually being impacted by those manual processes because they're making decisions based on bad data or bad information because the value chain is not connected. So this is a classic task top slide, if you will. But over the years, what we've seen is that these silos have continued to develop and build up. We've gotten very good at development and test and operations. And the focus has been on these individual silos. Testers have been focused on the idea of the testing center of excellence. Operations in ITIL, there's a lot of really best practices and a lot of improvement in the way that we've done things within these silos. There's also tools that specialize in these individual silos. But the problem is there's no flow, there's no traceability back and forth across those silos. And I would actually argue that we shouldn't be focusing on tearing down these silos, but continuing to build up the silos, because there's a lot of good that's coming from them. However, we need to make sure that there is focus on the end-to-end business process. There is focus on the end-to-end traceability and flow of information back and forth across the life cycle. So what we're going to focus on first, now that we've identified the value chain, we know how that work flows through the system, we know what tools come into play with that. We need to connect those couple remaining dots, if you will, figure out how we can take those pockets of traceability, eliminate the manual processes, and let the work flow freely from end to end. So here's how we're going to approach it. First of all, like I said, we've got demand that's being managed within ServiceNow. As those get created and approved, we're actually going to synchronize that demand across into Jira as a new feature. So we've got this automated synchronization now between the two systems so that not only does it get created in Jira at the appropriate time, but also any changes that are going to be happening to the demand after it's been approved, any change requests, for example, those will show up in Jira so that we always know what the latest and greatest is and what we need to be developing and testing against. Once that new feature, that demand, has been created on the Jira side, we're going to start to break that down into epics. Epic 1, Epic 2, Epic 3 in this case, and then we're also going to start to do further planning with these particular epics. So which application is this epic going to be impacting or enhancing in that case? What release is this particular epic assigned to? So we're starting to get this complexity where we have demand that is actually spanning multiple applications, it's spanning multiple releases, and we're able to manage this on the Jira side with the relationships within Jira. And I'm actually going to take and kind of jump into a couple of live demos as we go here. So starting with this first piece, I'm going to, in ServiceNow, I'm going to create this new demand, and we're going to implement single sign-on across our organization. This is a product development effort. And then we'll go ahead and submit this. So there's a couple of things now that are happening. We've got our new demand. This is just in pending, working through this, and as we start to step through the demand process, this isn't something that needs to be in Jira at this point because developers likely aren't going to be working on it right now until it gets to the approved point. So I'm just going to step through this one phase at a time of the demand and qualify it, and then ultimately I'm going to go ahead and approve this particular demand. So a couple of things now that we've approved this demand, that's going to be our trigger that says, okay, send this over to Jira as a new feature, and as my integration catches up with me here, systems were running a bit slow earlier, so this might take a second. All right, well that's running. As this demand is getting approved, now that's our trigger that says go ahead and synchronize this across into Jira so that the Jira team can take this newly defined new feature or demand, and we can start working on breaking this down further. So at this point, I'm going to create some new epics. Epic 1, and this is going to be associated with application A. And then let's Epic 2, and I'm going to keep these light on details just for the sake of a demo. And now we've got our epics that have been defined, and if I come in here, I'm actually going to link these back to the original demand or new feature that was created. So this is very much a key piece to having that end-to-end traceability across your entire lifecycle. We've automated the flow of demands out of ServiceNow into Jira. And then as we are breaking down that new feature into epics, it's going to give us the traceability back to that implement SSO feature and ultimately the implement SSO demand that was originally created on the ServiceNow side. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to assign this one to our August release. And I can say I want to start work on that. And Epic 2 is going to get assigned to September because, again, we've got this complexity, multiple applications, multiple releases, and there's just a lot of moving parts that are associated with this demand. So back to the slides, we've got this aspect of it, the automated flow, the synchronization of details, and then the breakdown of those features into epics, along with the relationships between the artifacts. Next up, and this is where things start to get a little bit tricky, because ServiceNow and Jira, those manage work items, those manage artifacts, if you will, and we can very easily relate one to the other. But when you start to look at release management and deployment types of tools, those tools don't necessarily care what epics or what features are represented in the code that they're deploying. All they know is that they've got a new version of code that they need to move from environment 1 to environment 2. So within that release management and deployment management tool, we've got our releases. Each release has multiple applications or a single application that could be associated with it. And then there are multiple environments that are we're going to be deploying this code to. And so there's not a direct kind of single relationship between each one of these. Rather, we start to look at Epic 1 in Jira has an application that's assigned to App A, and the release is the August release. And so we want to start to know when application A is being deployed to the dev environment for August, the prod environment for August, and these multiple pieces are what's really going to give us that traceability back and forth between the systems. So I have up next Microsoft TFS, where I've defined some of these releases, these deployments, and I'm going to go ahead and fire off a release for August. And I'm going to move a particular version of my application. First, it's going to go into my development environment. Then if that's successful, it's going to go into my production environment. I'm also going to go ahead and kick something off here in September. And for September, since that's going to be kind of our release +1, if you will, what this is going to do is it's actually just going to drop it in development for now. So these are running, and those are actually going to take the details of this is August and September. Everything I'm doing right now is specific to application A, and then we're dropping it into different environments. Okay, so we've got all of the pieces. We've automated the traceability between these such that we're able to actually tie demand all the way through to new features and epics, and then into our releases and deployments that are taking place in TFS. So now that we've identified the value chain, we've made sure that we've connected the value chain in different ways. The next step is actually measuring the value chain and understanding what we need to do to start to extract the data, and then what type of details we need to produce some of these reports. So when we started talking about lead time, at the highest level, we're really just focused on when is that demand created in ServiceNow and when is it being pushed to production. But in order for us to actually start to identify bottlenecks, we also need to know some key dates along the way. So when was the demand approved? How long did it take for an approved demand to become a new epic? And then how long until that epic was approved and ultimately scheduled? And then once it's scheduled and we start work on it, how long does it take for us to deploy to development? And then once we have kind of that first cut to development, what's the amount of time that's going to pass before we deploy into production? because this is going to be the key point as we start to identify that bottleneck and be able to say, all right, we've got a lot of time that it looks like it's taking right in here, so let's dig in a little further and see what's actually going on in that step of the value chain. But in order to get this, we need to take another step back. And again, we're going to move from left to right across the value chain, but we need to look at each one of the tools, understand the artifact in that tool, and figure out what details do I need from these tools that are going to allow me to produce the appropriate reports. So from the demand perspective, out of ServiceNow, we need to extract some unique identifiers. So what's the ID, what's the name, so that we know which particular demands we're talking about from ServiceNow. And then next, we need to know the status as well as some of the dates. So that way I know when the demand goes from pending to submitted, or from submitted to approved, we have visibility into when those transitions are happening for that particular artifact. And then new feature, I'll get to that one in a second. But as we step over into JIRA and start to look at the epics, we need to track similar types of details. What's the ID and the name so we can uniquely identify these individual epics? What's my status, as well as some of the associated dates, so that I know when it goes from created to approved to scheduled. And then skipping down here to the bottom, this is going to be the first key that we need to be able to trace or join this epic data back to our demand data that sits within ServiceNow. And this is actually all possible because of that synchronization that we had in place and ServiceNow demands creating automatically that new feature in JIRA and then having the relationship between the new feature and the epic. But from a data extraction perspective, we're going to ignore the feature and just leverage the fact that we have that relationship so that now we can join the demand directly to the epic in our database. And then finally on the deployment side, again, we've got a deployment ID, so we know which actual deployment we're looking at, as well as the status. Was this particular deployment successful or did it fail? When did that deployment happen? And then the last couple here are going to be what's necessary to connect the deployments to the epics. And these aren't as straightforward as being able to just say what's the feature and the related feature and joining that way. We actually need to leverage two fields in order to make this unique connection. One of them is going to be the release that the deployment is associated with and how that ties to the fixed version that's being set on the JIRA side. The other is the application. So in the example that we saw, this was the August release for application A, and that's going to allow us to join up this data and really complete that end-to-end aspect of this. So back into my demo environment. If I refresh here, these should have run by now. Ultimately, what we were doing with this is as the information was flowing across the lifecycle, as these changes were happening, we're aggregating this data, rolling it into a database so that we can see in more detail in kind of in an event-driven or an event log type of view that I have the date associated with when this particular demand went into pending. I know when it was submitted and when it was changed to screening, but ultimately I know when it was approved, and then I can see the relationship with the JIRA feature right here at the end. And then same thing on the JIRA side, we're getting a lot of this information on Epic 1 and Epic 2. I can see that same related feature, and again, this is what's going to allow us to connect this lifecycle data between the Epic and JIRA, the demand and ServiceNow. And again, just tracking those details like fixed version and the release that's associated with the application that we're doing this work for, and then all of that information again is just aggregating here believe those are the ones. Yep, aggregating here in our database so that, again, we can connect this back based on, I know that this is from application A, I know that this is when the August release went into a production environment. I can see that it was successful. So we've laid all the groundwork with identifying the value chain, making sure that we have automated flow and automated traceability across the life cycle, and now we're using TaskHop to extract this data as it's happening, getting it in real time into the database. Ultimately, what this will look like, and this is a kind of a rough view of what it would look like, but you can take this information and you can put this in your data warehouse. You can use tools that you already have in-house, like Tableau, for example, to produce reports that really help you drill into this data. TaskHop's aggregating this and accumulating this to allow you to produce these types of reports. So this is a basic one that I put together in Excel based on everything that we've extracted. But we can see that we've got this demand. We know when it was created as well as when it was approved. I can see that there are 3 epics associated with it across 2 applications. And then I know when those were successfully deployed into development and into production environments. So now we've got that level of detail, that end-to-end cycle time, or if you will. February 1st is when we started. The last code was deployed into production on September 10th, and that gives us the end-to-end. But we can start to look in here and see this was approved as a demand on February 3rd, but we didn't actually start creating epics in JIRA until June 3rd. So there's 4 months that passed where nothing appears to be happening. What's the delay? Why does it take so long for us to get from approved work to actually starting on that work? And so that's where the continuous improvement aspect of this comes into play. We've identified the value chain, we've connected it, we're extracting data, and we've started to see there are some bottlenecks based on the data that we've extracted. So now that we've identified that, maybe the bottleneck here is in somewhere in the code and test, build and verify area. Now we can start to, using the same process that we just talked about, or the same approach that we just talked about, we can drill into that even more. So drill into our value chain a little bit more, and within that epic in JIRA, not only does that represent the breakdown of stories and tasks, but also code check-ins that are happening in GitHub. Builds maybe are taking place in Jenkins instead of in TFS. We're using SonarQube for static code analysis, HPE ALM or Quality Center for testing, and then Selenium for some of the automated tests. So we can take that same approach, drill into these tools, make sure that we understand the value chain, the more specific value chain, connect that value chain, and then start to report on that value chain and drill into it a little bit more. So everything that we've talked about now has really been focused on the business value. And there are multiple sources of work in any organization, business value being one of them, probably the easiest to identify. And so this is going to be the business that's creating that demand, or customers that are creating that demand. However, you could take this same approach with other sources of work. So you've got defects that are being opened by your testing organization. Maybe you know that you're releasing with those defects or with those known issues, and those need to flow through the entire life cycle as well. So you can start to break things down for defects. And then the other aspect of this is going to be operations work. How do problems or incidents that are being reported by your customers, how do those flow through the value chain? And maybe where is the bottleneck as it applies to problems and incidents, because it might be different than some of the bottlenecks that you're experiencing with the business value. So to recap here, we started off at the highest level, identifying the value chain. We used TaskHop to connect it and make sure that data was flowing seamlessly across the various tools that you're using within your value chain. as well as making sure that we have the automated traceability there. And automated is the key, because if you don't have that automated traceability, then ultimately it's going to break down. You're going to start to have bad data, and when you have bad data that's feeding you reports, now you've got bad reports and you're making bad decisions based on that bad data. Once we have that all connected, we did the high-level end-to-end cycle time or end-to-end lead time reporting. And that's what's going to allow us to really focus in on some of the individual bubbles down here, where we can start to drill into more of the technical metrics and really figure out where the issues are coming from.